The floral wallpaper wasn't torn down in a fit of rage. It was covered in depth calculations written in grease pencil. Someone had done the math before they picked up the weapon. The call came into the Kenton County Sheriff's Office at 4:17 a.m. on November 23, 1954. It was placed by a tenant on the first floor of a boarding house on Scott Street. The caller, a dock worker named Otha Skaggs, reported a disturbance that had gone on for 6 hours, followed by a silence that felt heavier than the noise. When deputies arrived at 4:30, the front door was standing wide open. The November air was rushing into the hallway, but it couldn't displace the smell. It was a thick, chemical scent, like copper pennies dissolving in kerosene. Otha Skaggs was waiting on the porch, shivering, holding a tire iron. He pointed a shaking finger toward the second-floor landing. The subjects in room 2B were Arthur and Beatrice Ramsay. They had checked in 3 months prior. The landlady's ledger listed them as a married couple from Ohio, seeking industrial work. They paid in cash, weekly. They spoke to no one. The only evidence of their existence was the smoke from their cigarettes on the fire escape and the sounds through the ceiling. For 12 weeks, the tenants below listened to the Ramsays. It wasn't the sound of domestic arguments. Otha described it later as industrial. There was the sound of heavy furniture moving, the rhythmic scraping of metal on wood, and long periods of low, droning vocalizations. It sounded less like a marriage and more like a manufacturing process. On the night of November 22nd, the rhythm changed. The scraping stopped. The heavy thuds began. Otha testified that it sounded like a side of beef being dropped repeatedly onto the floorboards. Then came the shouting. It wasn't angry, it was frantic. One voice giving instructions, the other screaming in a pitch that suggested structural failure of the throat. At 3 a.m., the noise ceased. The silence that followed was absolute. Otha lay in his bed and staring at the ceiling, waiting for the next thud. It never came. Instead, 40 minutes later, he heard his own door handle turn. The latch popped. The door swung open. A silhouette stood in the frame, backlit by the hallway bulb. It was Arthur Ramsay. He was standing in Otha's bedroom, hunched over the dresser. In his right hand, he held a 1-gallon glass jug. Otha sat up, gripping the sheets. Arthur didn't attack. He didn't even look at Otha initially. He was opening the drawers, one by one, moving with the jerky, calibrated motions of a machine that was losing power. When Arthur finally turned, Otha saw the details. Arthur's shirt was saturated with a dark, viscous fluid that looked black in the low light. His eyes were wide, unblinking, the pupils dilated to the rim. He held up the empty glass jug. His voice was flat, devoid of adrenaline. He asked for gasoline. He said the work wasn't finished. Otha, operating on instinct, shouted for him to leave. The sudden noise seemed to reboot Arthur's processing. He stared at the jug, then at Otha, as if realizing he was in the wrong location. He didn't argue. He turned and sprinted. He ran down the hall, down the stairs, and out the front door into the night. That was when Otha called the police. The deputies moved up the stairs with weapons drawn. Room 2B was unlocked. The door had been pushed inward, cracking the frame. The smell of copper was overpowering here, mixed with the sharp tang of accelerant. The single overhead bulb was swinging slightly, casting moving shadows across the wallpaper. The room had been modified. The furniture had been pushed to the perimeter. The center of the room was a workspace. The rug had been rolled up and shoved into the corner. The floorboards were exposed. In the center of the room sat a sofa angled toward the window. On the sofa lay Beatrice Ramsay. At first glance, she appeared to be sleeping. Deputy Carver approached the subject. From the doorway, she looked intact. As he got closer, the anomaly became clear. Beatrice was not sleeping. The upper portion of her cranial structure had been subjected to extreme percussive force. The trauma was catastrophic. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a demolition. Lying next to the sofa was the instrument. It was a 6-pound industrial hammer, the iron head uncoated in biological material. But it was the rest of the room that stopped the deputies cold. The walls were covered in markings. Not words, but measurements, angles, depth calculations written in grease pencil on the floral wallpaper. The ceiling above the sofa had been breached. The plaster was hacked away, exposing the lathe and the joists. But the damage wasn't random. The holes followed the electrical and gas lines. Sections of pipe had been exposed, labeled with tags made of masking tape. The tags bore times and dates. The investigation would later reveal that Arthur hadn't just attacked his wife. He had spent the hours before the termination dismantling the room. The floorboards near the radiator were pried up. The baseboards were removed. He was looking for something inside the structure of the house itself. Beatrice was just another structure he had dismantled. Arthur Ramsay was apprehended 40 minutes later, 3 blocks east, trying to siphon fuel from a parked truck. He offered no resistance. When Officer Kemp handcuffed him, Arthur didn't ask for a lawyer. He asked if the fire had started yet. He claimed the containment had failed, and thermal reduction was the only option left. The forensic team arrived at 6 a.m. They began processing room 2B. The first anomaly was the timeline. The coagulation of the biological fluids on the sofa suggested Beatrice had expired hours before Otha heard the thuds. The sounds the neighbors heard weren't the murder. They were the post-mortem activity. Medical examiner Dr. Ashford arrived to secure the body. His initial assessment noted that the percussive trauma to the cranium was the cause of death, but he found other marks. Beatrice's hands were covered in older scars, small, precise incisions on the fingertips, healed puncture wounds on the forearms. She had been a participant in something long before that night. The inventory of the room revealed a collection of glass jars beneath the sink. They contained fluid samples, not gasoline, but biological drainage. Each jar was labeled with a date and a temperature reading. The Ramsays had been tracking a cycle. They believed something was changing inside their own biology. A notebook was found under the mattress. It belonged to Beatrice. The entries were clinical, written in a steady hand. She documented symptoms that didn't exist in medical textbooks. She described her bones feeling too hot and her skin feeling too tight. The final entry, dated November 22nd, simply read, "Extraction required." The thuds Otha heard were Arthur attempting to perform this extraction. The hammer wasn't a weapon in his mind. It was a surgical tool. He believed the bone was the barrier preventing the pressure from releasing. The tragedy was that Beatrice had likely agreed to the procedure. There were no defensive wounds on her arms. The scene revealed a shared delusion of physical transformation. They believed the boarding house environment, the pipes, the gas lines, the vibrations, was affecting their cellular structure. The holes in the ceiling were attempts to find the transmission source. When they couldn't find it in the walls, they looked for it in themselves. Arthur Ramsay was processed at the county jail. During his interrogation, he spoke of Beatrice in the present tense. He explained that the shell had cracked, but the core was still trapped. He needed the gasoline to purify the site and complete the process. He viewed the homicide as a failed technical operation. The autopsy was conducted on November 24th. Dr. Ashford confirmed the cause of death was blunt force trauma. However, X-rays revealed something disturbing. Beatrice's ribs showed multiple healed fractures. Her shins showed evidence of microfractures consistent with repeated low-velocity impact. This calibration had been going on for years. Investigators contacted authorities in Ohio. They found a trail of eviction notices. In each previous residence, landlords reported damage to the walls and floors. Holes drilled in plaster, floorboards removed. The Ramsays had been hunting this signal across 3 state lines, dismantling their homes and themselves as they went. The milk jug Arthur carried was analyzed. It contained traces of kerosene, but also residue of a compound used in industrial cleaning. He had been mixing a solvent. The plan wasn't just arson, it was a chemical dissolution. He intended to erase the room, the body, and the failed experiment completely. The horror of the case wasn't the violence, but the cooperation. Beatrice Ramsay sat on that sofa and let her husband pick up the hammer. She believed it was the cure. The forensic reconstruction showed she was seated upright facing him when the first blow was struck. She was waiting for the release. The boarding house was evacuated for 3 days while the structural damage was assessed. The exposed gas lines in room 2B were a significant hazard. Had Arthur succeeded in acquiring the accelerant, the resulting explosion would have leveled the block. The neighbors had slept through a chemical time bomb. But the investigation found one final piece of evidence. Behind the plaster in the ceiling where Arthur had hacked the deepest hole, they found a small rusted metal box. It didn't belong to the Ramsays. It was old. It contained a specimen tooth and a lock of hair from the 1920s. This discovery changed the context. The Ramsays were delusional, yes, but they had correctly identified a hidden anomaly in the house. Their madness had acted as a divining rod. They sensed something was wrong with the structure, even if their interpretation was biologically impossible. They were sensitive instruments, calibrated to the wrong frequency. The trial was brief. Arthur Ramsay was declared competent to stand trial, despite the nature of his defense. The jury saw the photos of the room, the hammer, and the jars. They didn't see a medical procedure. They saw a massacre. He was convicted of first-degree murder in February 1955. Beatrice Ramsay was buried in a pauper's grave in Linden Grove Cemetery. No family came to claim her. The state handled the interment. Her death certificate listed cranial trauma as the cause, but the coroner's private notes mentioned systematic self-modification as a contributing factor. The Harrow boarding house never fully recovered its reputation. Tenants moved out. The room on the second floor remained vacant. The smell of copper and kerosene lingered in the floorboards, defying all attempts at cleaning. It wasn't a stain. It was a memory soaked into the wood. Otha Skaggs moved out a week after the incident. He told police he couldn't sleep. Every time the pipes rattled or the floor settled, he heard the hammer. He heard the calm, rhythmic thud of a man trying to fix his wife. He moved to a ground-floor apartment across the river. Arthur Ramsay was sent to the Kentucky State Penitentiary. He was a model prisoner. He kept his cell meticulously clean. Guards reported that he would spend hours tapping on the stone walls, listening to the echo, checking for hollow spots. He told the chaplain he was just checking the pressure. In 1961, a maintenance crew at the prison found Arthur in the laundry services wing. He had dismantled a washing machine and was arranging the parts in a circle on the floor. He claimed the machine was singing the same song as the house in Covington. He was trying to silence it. The case file was closed, but the questions remained. The Ramsays were isolated, drifting predators of their own bodies. But the precision of their madness suggested a pattern. They hadn't invented this protocol. They were following instructions that no one else could hear. The rusted box found in the ceiling was logged into evidence and forgotten. It was a relic of a previous tragedy, unconnected to the Ramsays. Or so the police concluded. But the fact that Arthur found it, blind and mad, hacking through lath and plaster, suggests he knew exactly where to look. The hammer was destroyed. The jars were disposed of. The notebook was archived in the county basement. The words, "Extraction required," remain written in blue ink, a testament to a love that expressed itself through demolition. They were a closed loop of destruction. Arthur Ramsay died in custody in 1974, heart failure. He was found in his bunk, hands folded over his chest. In his pocket, they found a piece of mortar he had chipped from the wall. It was wrapped in a scrap of paper labeled Specimen 14. The room in Covington was eventually boarded up. The house stood for another decade before being condemned. When the demolition crew finally tore it down in 1985, they found holes in the framing of every room. Someone else had been looking for the veins long before Arthur arrived. Justice was served, in the legal sense. A man was imprisoned. A body was buried. But the narrative of Room 2B defies the neat boxes of the law. It wasn't a fight. It was a project. And in the end, Arthur only regretted that he ran out of time. The Scott Street property is a parking lot now. The asphalt covers the basement and the earth where the Ramsays once listened to the vibrations. But on quiet nights, locals say you can still hear the settling of the earth. A rhythmic, heavy thud. The Ramsays believed they could fix the human condition with a hammer. They were wrong. But looking at the evidence, at the precision of the wounds and the calmness of the aftermath, one has to wonder what they thought they were building.